In this presentation, we are going to be looking at indulgences. Now, indulgences are ways in which we can remit the temporal punishment due to sin, the guilt of which has been forgiven. So, to explain that a little bit, the indulgences are extra sacramental, meaning they kind of go above and beyond the sacrament of penance and reconciliation, but they're based upon it. The indulgences do not forgive sin. Only the sacrament of penance and reconciliation does that. However, some punishment for sin remains. The indulgences only remit or erase or get rid of the punishment due to sin that's already been forgiven in the sacrament. And we have to understand the idea of something being vicarious. That is, the merits and the satisfaction that others have won through their good works is being applied to our punishment. That's what's happening in indulgences. So to understand indulgences, you need to understand the punishment of sin. Every sin incurs a double consequence. So mortal sin especially, because mortal sin incurs eternal punishment, which is removed in confession, and temporal punishment, which is the attachment to sin and to creatures. Um, Venial sin does not incur eternal punishment, only temporal punishment. Now, temporal punishment, this attachment to sin that we have, this kind of disordered inclination to sin, that remains after confession and is something that needs to be purified in the person. If we have temporal punishment remaining at the end of life, even though we're in a state of grace, we must be purified in purgatory. Well, indulgences are ways in which we can get rid of that temporal punishment. And actually, there are two ways to get rid of temporal punishment. The first is penance. We can be assigned a penance in penance and reconciliation, but we can also take on voluntary penances to get rid of temporal punishment. And the other way, of course, is an indulgence. The difference is that a penance is something that we do in order to gain satisfaction. Indulgence is actually the grace or the good gift of someone else's merits and satisfaction that's being applied to us. So in order to understand that idea of a grace or a favor from someone else being applied to us, we have to understand the communion of saints. So the communion of saints, all saints throughout all time have a bond with one another through the mystical body of Christ, the church. That bond is charity. And it's through charity, acts of charity, that we gain merit. It's only by the grace of Christ earned on the cross that we can perform acts of charity. Christ's work on the cross has infinite value. The Blessed Virgin Mary, who was without sin, performed wonderful acts of charity, which also surpass all temporal punishment that could ever be assigned to humans. But at the same time, the saints themselves, the saints who entered heaven upon death, were able to not only remit their own temporal punishment, but also gain and add to the stores of what is known as the treasury of the church of these good graces, these merits, these satisfactions. So it's from that treasury, that store, that the church gives to us this grace and this satisfaction if we obtain an indulgence, because the church holds the keys, and the keys govern not only the mercy of forgiveness, but also the remitting of temporal punishment. So in order to obtain an indulgence, you first of all have to perform the action that's usually attached to the indulgence, like praying a rosary. And then you need to be in a state of grace. You need to have complete interior detachment from sin, even venial sin. You need to perform sacramental confession. You need to receive Holy Communion. And then finally, you need to pray for the intentions of the Pope. Now, there are three key distinctions of indulgences. The first and the most important is plenary versus partial. A plenary indulgence is the full remitting of all temporal punishment that a soul might have. A partial, of course, is only a portion. Then there's perpetual versus temporary. Some indulgences are only are perpetual, like praying of the rosary, meaning you can always gain an indulgence for that. Some are temporary, meaning they're only applied for a certain time or at a certain place. And then some are real or personal. Some are real in that they are applied anywhere and everywhere, and personal are only given to certain people, like a religious order.